Instead of going for a full-blown chart in Excel, we now have the ability to add sparklines to your data. What these are effectively inline little mini graphs that can display the pattern of the data. Let's take our sales data 2013 and demonstrate as an example. Let's start with the January file. If we wanted to create a chart, we could do that, highlight the data, create a chart. If instead what we wanted is a little sparkline, perhaps here in this cell, let's widen it so it would be quite a long sparkline, have a little mini graph here that shows me how this data looks. A little mini graph here, a little mini graph here, how that data looks. And then for the West, another little mini graph. Well, those are sparklines. Now, to insert sparklines, you don't actually need to highlight anything to start with, but if we do highlight where we would like the sparklines to go, it will make one little step easier in the sparkline process. We then go to the Insert ribbon, come along to Sparklines. It has its own little section. There are three different types of sparkline graph. There's a line, that's a straightforward line that you would get in a line chart. There are columns, so again like a column chart. And then there's a win-loss, which effectively is a column but has the ability to show negative numbers around the zero axis. Let's start with a line sparkline. So I'd like a sparkline that is a line. Now I need to tell it where the data is. I also need to tell it where to put the sparklines. And because I highlighted these 4 cells here, the assumption is these 4 cells is where you would like the sparklines to go, and that is already pre-entered. If I'd highlighted nothing, then I would need to go and enter this range as well. I do need to enter the data range, so I click in and then click and highlight my data, which is north, south, east and west, and then each of the types of transportation that we have sold. That's B3 to H6, and the sparklines will go into J3 to J6. Okay, and the sparklines appear. So these are relative representations of the value within each cell. With the sparkline selected, I get the Sparkline Tools Design Sensitive ribbon, which will allow me perhaps to put markers on so I can see where each of the points are. I've got a start, so I can see 245 is that one, then 34, then 345, then 656, then 967, then 1278, then 1589. So pretty much on all of these, there is a gradient upwards in the values. Now the sparklines, like normal charts, respond to changes in the data. So if I go into here and make a massive dent in the helicopter sales for the east, that then adjusts the sparkline, and you can see that that little peak dropped down. Do the same here for the horses in the west. Let's go right down to 234, and you can see again there's a little dent in the sparkline, a little mini chart. So with the sparkline selected, we get the context sensitive ribbon. In here we can make the changes. We already added markers. We could add the last point and the first point if we didn't want markers. With the markers on, you can't see the difference between the first and last. The first and last would work without the markers. We could actually ask it to highlight the high point without the markers because it's actually at the end of all of them, and the low point, which is consequently the second value in all of them. But if we again adjust, let's go to 460, that then is no longer the lowest point. This point here is. Back into the sparklines. We can adjust the style. There's different colors up here. I could have a different color line. I could have a different color line with a different point. I can customize the sparkline color myself. So if one of the pre-built styles is not what I'm after, I might want an orange line. And I can customize the marker color. So we have different markers. The default marker color, the high point marker, the low point marker, the first point, the last point. If I change all my markers to red, then we get some red markers. The high and the low remain as the default blue. I can also control the axis. Here it's set to automatic for each sparkline. Within a sparkline, it decides on how to spread these out based on the lowest and the highest value. If we say the axis must be the same for all sparklines, then the scale must be the same. So if you're trying to compare sparkline to sparkline for a set of data, then really you ought to change that so it is the same for all sparklines. And the same for the maximum value as well. So now you can compare these sparklines to each other for relative sales without them being effectively linked to each other. So I'd make them go back to automatic for each sparkline. Then the line is relative, only within its own values. So here we have some values. If we made them really quite small, then within itself, the graph can be used to compare. We say, oh, the high point is there. which is the fourth one, 1, 2, 3, 4, helicopters sold. But you couldn't compare that line to that line because the values are so much lower. But if we went into design and said, actually, it needs to be the same for all sparklines, then you can see that that top sparkline is pretty much flat because the values are so low compared to the other values. It all depends on how you're using the sparkline, whether you want it to be just a graphical representation of the values in that particular range, or whether you need them to be compared to each other. We can also change the sparkline to one of the other two types. So we have a column and we have a win-loss. Now all of the values here are positive, so they're all effectively above the 0 line. The column one looks quite good. Again, it retains what you've ticked in here. I've got high point ticked and low point ticked. If I take those off, then there's no differential between the colors of each of the columns. That's introduced you to sparklines, and you can see their use. Nice and pretty inline graphs, really, allowing you to quickly compare values in a row or even in a column. There wouldn't be nothing to stop us doing this along here. Insert sparklines. That's my data. Okay. And then you get a little mini graph that compares the values vertically. So that graph represents those 4 values there. Stick the markers on and you can see there are 4 values marked on. Clever little graphs, very easy to get, and with a bit of customization can help add that graphical appearance to your numbers.